Hello everybody and welcome to St Mary's Church in Chiddingfold in Surrey. I come across a rather unusual building behind me with a grass sort of roof that you can actually walk over. I've never seen that before. Anyways, one thing I get often asked about is what is the RunBritain Handicap and how it all works. So I thought I'd do a little video trying to explain that today. So let's just start by going to the actual site. So what we want is runbritainrankings.com, which I've already got here. Here's the homepage. And so let's just look up a few people that we know. Let's start with myself. So if we go to the runners tab, then you can look up somebody. These are all just UK athletes, so I'm afraid if you're not from the UK, I'm afraid we probably won't have you, but maybe one day your country can do something similar. So let's just look up myself, Grose Tim. Won't put my club in, it's optional. And if it finds one match, it should go straight to me. So here we are. This is myself. I'm actually 55 very shortly. Today's the recorded this on the 13th of November, and I'm 55 on the 22nd. So I haven't got much longer time left in the M50 ranks, and I'll soon be up to M55. There's my current handicap, 3.9, and of all the people in the UK, I'm 15,091. And if we go down here, that is actually 50,091 of all the men. Of all the men or women, I'm 16,348. Of all the people in the UK who are in 50s, I'm 665th. And in my postcode area, I'm 8th. If you go down to the M50s, I've got the highest or the best handicap, i.e. the lowest one out of all the M50s where I live. So here's my progress handicap graph. We started this thing in 2010 more or less, and I was sort of rose up to the peak there. When was my peak? In 2013 I managed to get to 1.0. I think I probably would have been negative had I had this years ago, but then my trough there was right down to there in 2012. That's because I had a very bad accident in the October of 2011. I ended up in hospital for a while, didn't run for ages, so I plummeted right down there, and then a few sort of other plummets when I've had various injuries. Didn't really run much at all in 2017 or 2018, so it plummeted there, but it's been gradually creeping back up. I haven't actually raced for a while now, since the summer, and so it's been sort of steady. We kind of froze it during COVID, and then it's been gradually dropping down a bit. That's because of the time penalties, which I'll refer to next. So if we look up somebody like the Ford runner Andy Raynor, and yeah, he's the Forester Dean, so there is his handicap there, 0.4, and if we show it, his rise has been pretty steady actually. That's a classic example of somebody who started off at a relatively low level, has been getting better and better and better, and at the moment his handicap's as high as it's ever been. If you look up the TV personality Jenni Falconer and the RunPod host, we can see that she started off with a handicap of around about 11.7 there, got it up to a peak just under 9.9 there, but she seems to have been falling ever since, and doesn't look like she's actually had a race that we've noted since 2019 London Marathon. Now I picked her because when we started the handicap, she was in the initial publicity shot, so it's interesting to see that her progress hasn't been quite as good as Andy's over the years. Let's just pick one more. Let's pick the Welsh runner Matt Rees. And his handicap is a very impressive -2.8, but you can still see he's just outside the top 1,000 in the country. So just shows you how many good runners there are. And by and large, his handicap's been better and better and better. It's been perhaps a bit flat lines in recent years. Okay, so let's go on to talk about how the handicap is actually calculated. Now, I don't have a spreadsheet today, but I do have a PowerPoint, and I've had to rearrange it so you can see me and the PowerPoint on the screen. So what do we do? The first thing we do is for each race that you do, which includes a park run as well, your time is converted into a basic point score on a golf handicap scale, because all the handicaps are basically like golf handicaps. That's kind of where it's derived from. So basically that's 0 to 54, although there are some very good athletes who are slightly negative. 0 kind of reflects like the equivalent of a scratch golfer, who's a very good golfer, but not necessarily a Tiger Woods style player who might be well negative. I think Tiger Woods may be as low as sort of -8 or -10 even, something like that. And the likes of Mo Farah is around about -7. And the actual point scores are based on an age graded tables, but without the actual age grade bit, so it's effectively the senior equivalents. And then the basic score is then adjusted by a measure of the course difficulty, which we call the SSS, or standard scratch score, which is a term borrowed from the old golf handicap scheme, which is just recently changed, but the principles still hold true, whereas different courses were kind of rated not according to how many strokes you might take like the par, but how difficult they are. And we're going to talk about how that's actually derived in a minute. And there's a further adjustment, what we call a time penalty. That's to give more weight to recent performances. So if a performance, say, was like a year ago, then we might add on a bit of point score to that performance to essentially downgrade it. And then your handicap score is then basically the average of your 5 best adjusted scores. So the basic score with these 2 adjustments for the standard scratch and the time penalty. So how is the standard scratch score SSS computed? Well, again, each runner's time in a race, as I said before, is converted into a basic point score on this golf handicap scale, which is based on the age graded tables. And then we work out what is your best point score for each of the runner in a fairly recent race of a similar distance. So basically to compare what you've done on that particular day with your best ever, or at least best ever recently. And then the difference between those 2 scores is each person's my standard scratch score or my SSS. So example here, that if you ran 20 minutes exactly for 5k, which is actually 9.7 points on this scale, but your best 5k time is 19 minutes, which is 7.6, then the MySS would be the difference between the two at 2.1. So after some filtering, the median of all these MySS scores for everybody is the SSS for that race. So that basically means that if you ran very, very slowly, you just sort of like jog around, wasn't trying, you would tend to sort of drop out with the filtering. But if you ran very close to your PB, then your MySS would be quite low, maybe even be slightly negative. So an SSS of 0, or it can even be slightly negative, means largely ideal conditions. PBs are very likely, through to the maximum SSS we give of 10, where it'll be very tough indeed. That might be sort of like a snowbound course, a really hilly course, a muddy course. It was massively windy, and a combination of all of those factors. And there's a very rough guide. 1.0 SSS points over 5k equates to about 30 seconds. 10k is about a minute, marathon's about 5 minutes, but it is mildly progressive. So that means as the performances get slower, then these gaps get slightly wider, and as you get really good elite times, then it's just fractionally tighter, but there's not much in it. So going into what is the point? Well, it's a way to measure your progress because you can see how your performances rate against other people and yourself. It's hopefully motivating because it only rewards good runs but does not penalise the bad ones, because I just mentioned there only your 5 best recent performances count. It provides a way of comparing your performances over different distances and different conditions. So it could be a cross-country race, very muddy, or it could be a road race, it's a bit hilly, it could be a day when it's windy, it could be ideal conditions, so obviously that's a chance of getting a better performance. It provides a way of comparing yourself against others. That's the national ladder that we'll have another look at in a minute. And of course stats are good, right? In my case, very good, yeah? Just quickly going down to some of the factors for fast or slow races, why this thing is quite important. So just read through these. The surface could be all types of surfaces. Some are obviously faster surfaces like road and track. Hills are obviously going to play a factor. The weather's going to play a factor. Other runners are going to play a factor as well. If you've got a big group, it's going to be easier to draft behind. If the course was like twisty, even though it was flat, could be a factor. Could even be a factor, of course, if the course isn't actually what it says it is. And then, of course, how yourself does on the day. Although that shouldn't really affect the overall theme because that's just you, and everyone else should get sort of factored out in this. So there's so many different factors why a race could be fast or slow, and it isn't necessarily the obvious things like sort of if it's hilly or not, or even if it's on the road or not. Even down to sort of other runners sometimes as well can be a big factor. So let's have a further look at the handicap for some people. So I'll take my own. I'll just hide these panels here. You can click them, these blue ones, and they minimise. So we're going down to my performances. So I display the performances on our profile page as default in handicap counting order. So that's the +1, +2, +3, +4, +5 there. So that means that my best performance of late, according to this, was my 800 last year in 2:18:59. And then I also got my pool park run there on Christmas Day 2019. I haven't done one since, actually. Ought to get one out and do one again. There was my marathon in 2020, 2:56:53, somewhat better than my one recently at 3:09, which kind of illustrates why that 3:09 needs some work to be improved on. I think one of my also most pleasing performances of recent times was that 10-mile time there, 61:40. Which is now quite a while ago, actually. That was best part of 2 years ago. We actually froze handicaps during the COVID period, so we didn't apply any of those time penalties during that period. And then my fifth counting performance was the Christchurch in Dorset 10k, also at the back end of 2019. My best performance of late has been this 800 224.20. That was the one that I was the oldest by about 40 years in the race. Did a video on that, and did another video there on my best 5k of the summer. Was a road race in Battersea Park 1827. They were just outside the top 5, although they may filter back in when some of these ones decay more. And also you can see that on this view that I give the SSS was only 0.2, so, and then the VSS was minus 2.0. So it might actually help if I show you a secret little switch I've got, which to show you a bit more detail. Now you can actually in theory show you this, but I would have to tell you the URL secret. So I put this debug facility on, gives a bit more detail about these performances. So it talks about some of the things I mentioned in the PowerPoint. So my 218.59 has a basic score of 4.8, and then the parkrun 17.59 is 5.5, the marathon there 6.1, the 10 mile 5.3, and the 10k 6.0. So as a raw performance, the 800 is definitely the best, but what's interesting is that the 10 mile time would have come second on pure performance terms, but it's actually ranked 4th. Now the reason for that largely is due to the SSS. So being a track race in the summer, I think most people were motivated by that. The SSS was quite a low 0.2, so everyone was doing quite well. Conversely, the pool park run got quite a large field. Maybe it was Christmas Day, a bit of a factor that maybe not everyone was trying, but by and large those factors get taken out, but maybe there's an element there that doesn't always quite work. But anyway, that one was 1.2, so that was relatively a bit higher. And that Christchurch 10k, I remember it was quite a windy day, that one. I remember there was one mile that really was digging into it, so that came out quite high. And the marathon and the Great South Run, that was a reasonably low score for long distance races, 0.8. So what you can see here is that my minimum score, i.e. the best performance point score that I'd done prior to this 800, was only a 6.6. So that means that the difference between the two, my SS was minus 1.8, and then the VSS is basically the MySS minus your SSS. So minus 1.8 minus 0.2 gives the minus 2.0. But in terms of the actual handicap system, all we're interested in is the basic score minus the SSS gets the 4.6, which is the net score or the adjusted score that I mentioned earlier. And there's a further adjustment for the time penalty. Now, and the time penalties actually start at minus 1.5. I think I did some rebasing of what was the actual point scoring before. So that means that one has started to erode, but you still need to basically add those two together. So 4.6 adjusted by minus 0.9 gives the 3.7. So that's the actual score that counts for the handicaps. And you can see in my other ones there, 3.8, 3.8, 4.0 and 4.3 were all fairly similar. So if you've done quite a lot of races and you're racing consistently, these 5 scores should all be fairly similar. Then your average then is not going to be too much worse than your best performance and not too much better than your 5th one. So 3.9 for me is kind of smack bang in the middle. If I can get a performance in that's slightly better than this one here, then hopefully I can just drop that down by 0.1 or 0.2, but I'm not going to really drastically reduce that unless I have some amazing performance and I keep doing that. So let's have a closer look where the 6.6 came from. Oh, there we go. I think I found it there. 225.1 scored 6.6, and that was actually the previous year to the 2021. So I think that was my best performance in an event like an 800. I was an 800, 6.6. So that explains where that 6.6 comes from. Now the 5.3, I think that's come from the Great South Run, because you see here that was done on Christmas Day 2019, but the Great South Run was a bit before it. So a 10 mile just about counts for a 5k because it's just considered just about similar enough. And then the marathon, also the minimum score there was a 5.3. I think again that came from the Great South Run. And the Great South Run itself, because obviously they can't count for the thing, that was a 5.4. So what was the 5.4? It might be easy if we just search for it. Oh, there we go. There's the 5.4. It was my Redcar Park Run in 1757 was the 5.4. So let's look at somebody else. Now, a guy called Scott Burrell has got in contact with me because he seems quite interested in the algorithm and invited me to discuss his one. So let's look him up. Now, I think he's the guy from Halma because he's quite a good athlete there, 1.5 handicap. So let's look at his page. Actually, his handicap as of now is 1.6. Those figures you see, and also in the national ladder, are slightly cached because it's such an effort to compute all these handicaps. We've literally got hundreds of thousands of people. But it's interesting here that his best two performances came in 2 half marathons. Both had quite low SSS scores. Now, the Antrim Coast one, unfortunately, that was where the women's world record was set, or at least it was until it was recently broken again, but it was found to be short. But it doesn't actually matter with the algorithm because the algorithm takes in account of that. And then, although you can see that it was a very fast SSS, which perhaps might be a clue as to why the course was found to be short. And Valencia, that's probably one of the fastest courses in the world, if not the fastest. I think numerous world records have been set there. But what's also interesting, he's also got part runs in here, which are a minute apart. Now, the reason for that is that the 2 part runs there have got SSS is of just over 2 or 2 exactly. And this road race he did had an SSS of 0. And if you remember from earlier, a point in SSS of a 5k is about 30 seconds. So 2 points is about a minute. So if we're just looking at this as a rule of thumb, those 2 performances are a minute slower than the road race, but have come out basically more or less the same. So if we look at the debug view, we'll get a bit of a closer inspection of that. And there you can see, yeah, the 3.0 we got for the 5k. The basic scores for those 2 very similar times were 5.0 and 5.1, but both of them had very similar high SSSs. Well, that kind of shows, without knowing too much about these part runs, that the conditions were basically not as fast. Now, you might argue, is that because part runners don't typically all try? So there's an element of that. I tried where possible to try and minimise that as much as possible, but maybe if you've got very low sample size, it doesn't always quite work out for the best, but it's quite difficult with the amount of data we've got. But anyway, it kind of shows the point that if these 2 part runs really were quite difficult, then this 5k road race, even though it was a lot faster, basically comes out in the wash pretty much exactly the same. And then if you look at the next one down, which is a 10k, it only got a 5.4 basic score, so considerably inferior to that 5k on paper, but the SSS for that one was actually 2.2. So when you do all the sums, those 2 adjusted performances both come out at 1.8, and there must be just sort of a slight difference in the second decimal place while the 5k gets it over the 10k. But again, it sort of illustrates the point that what you might think is a worse performance on paper is actually, by this method, pretty much equivalent, which is kind of the whole point of the thing, to sort of give you a better idea of the actual real worth of performances when the conditions may be different. Let's have a look at one more person. So Michael Young is a person that we often feature in our analysis videos. He's the guy that won the Chester Marathon recently, and he's the guy from West Cheshire. So his handicap is currently minus 2.7, so it's very similar handicap to Matt Rees. Not quite as good, so he's just slightly a higher handicap. The lower handicap, the better you have, so the more negative it is for the elite athletes, the better runner you are, basically. So he's just outside the top 1,000. I think we did remark before that his marathon is his best event, and sure enough, the marathon pops up at the top of the list here. And then he's got some half marathons, 10-mile races, all quite long races basically. Another marathon that he did, I think that was the big, somewhere near York, I think. And that also counts. All these SSS scores are quite high actually, they're all above 1. So let's have a further look at his debug, see if we can gain a bit more insight. And interesting there, his basic score for the marathon was minus 0.7. So that's considerably the best score in absolute performance terms as well. And with the SSS being 1.5, then his adjusted score was minus 3.7. Now you can see that's really much better than his next 4, which are all basically quite close. So it does illustrate how good a performance that was for him relatively. And his VSS there, minus 2.1, which is very high. If you've got any VSS which is negative, you're doing well. But it's somewhere as high as minus 2.1, you really have had a good day. And it'd be interesting to see how he gets on in Valencia, because he's going for a 2:24. But it might ironically be the case that Valencia being a very fast course, the SSS might be considerably lower. So it might, in real terms, he actually runs considerably faster than that Chester time, but it doesn't necessarily knock this one off. And that's one of the interesting points of the algorithm. And you can see that this marathon had the worst basic score of these 5 counting, but it had the highest SSS. So when you do the sums, it still gets into the top 5. You can see in Michael's case, though, he's going to have to basically put in more performances of this level to get his handicap down. But it does illustrate that his potential is to a handicap based on that one single performance is actually considerably better than his minus 2.7. And when you get that good, reducing handicap at all is going to be quite difficult. Let's have a look at the national ladder. We'll do women first, so I'm not being accused of being male biased. And you can hopefully see here that all the best female runners in the country are featured, with Alicia McColgan on top. She's been running amazingly well of late. Laura Whiteman, she hasn't had such a good time of late. She's been injured, but she's done some really amazing performances previous year. So with the handicap freeze, I think she's still there. Charlotte Purdue was the third fastest time ever for a recent London Marathon performance. Lara Muir, of course, Olympic medalist. Jess Judd was in the Olympics. Gemma Reekie was fourth in the Olympics. Keely Hodgkinson was even better than in the Olympics, but maybe in fact their handicaps are almost identical. They'll have to go down to the third decimal place to separate those two. But you can also see that how good these female athletes are, because Alicia McColgan's handicap at minus 4.1 is considerably better than both Matt Rees and Michael Young. And in fact, those two guys would actually struggle to get in the top 10 of the women. Also, scrolling down a bit, we've got Stephanie Davis there, who was the first British woman home in the Olympics in the marathon at 16th. Now, another athlete we featured in the recent videos was Emma Stiles, the 2:42 marathon runner, who's also done a lot of cycling, more cycling than running, it seems, from her training. And you can see that although she's got a very impressive handicap of 1.2, she's only 273rd in the country. So it just goes to show how good some of these athletes are, that a 2:42 marathon runner would only be ranked on handicap 273rd best woman in the country. So let's have a look at the men. And Mo Farah has been pretty much the number one on the ladder ever since we started in about 2010, but he's finally been knocked off. I think he's now getting to the point where he might start to drop down a bit, but he's still got some amazing performances there. So only Mark Scott, who actually beat him, I think, in the Olympic trials. I think he was the first British athlete to beat Mo in a race for a considerable number of years. I think if you discount the superstars defeat in the 100 metres, I'll have to put up who actually beat him. And then we've got some other very well good runners there. Andrew Bouchard, who was in the Olympics. Elliot Giles, 800 metre run in the Olympics. Ben Connor, he represented Britain in the Olympics. Jack Rowe's been running very well recently. Jake Whiteman was in the 1500 in the Olympics. So all the sort of top runners in the country. It's obviously not just seniors. So if we look in my age group, M50, my handicap, if you remember, is 3.9. But I've got some way to go to catch up with Jonathan Walton at minus 3.0. Now if you remember, he's the top male M50 marathon runner in the country. You've also featured in my recent videos of their training. And Mark Simons was also in there as well. He's the best 8 and 15 runner in the country for M15. He's also in there in the top 10. So, and then interesting, my friend Steve Winder, he's also there in 12th place. Now he's the guy that does relatively very little running at all and lots of cycling, so I'm just amazed how well he's doing actually. And I'm not quite sure when his most recent performance is, but let's have a quick look. So yeah, his handicap is basically getting better and better as he's getting older and older. It's dropped off slightly of late, but when did he actually last have a race? Oh, Mole Valley Park Run there quite recently. So yeah, getting under 18 minutes in the Mole Valley Park Run is quite impressive. What's his best counting performance? Although must have had a very muddy one there, 18:31. I think Steve definitely excels on the cross-country races. It looks like all these counting performances races have come in cross-country races. So that's interesting in itself. Either Mole Valley Park Run, which basically is a cross-country, or we've got some ones here. That's the Surrey League One and the South of Thames Championships. So going back to National Ladder, it's not just Masters athletes and seniors. We can also do junior athletes as well. So let's look at the under-17 women here. And the leading athlete on handicap is Louisa Brown from Gaskew with a handicap of 0.0, which is basically the scratch handicapper. That doesn't necessarily mean you're the best runner ever. That just means that you're extremely high standard. And let's see what events she excels at. Well, she's actually got quite a range actually. She's it's like a 3k and 1500 metre runner with a bit of cross country as well as her top performances. And all her best performances were actually of late, so clearly in good form. You look at her graph there, it's been shooting up and up and up. So as you would expect from one of the leading athletes in the country, or the leading athlete by my handicap system, this one anyway. For good measure here, the under-17 men. The top one at the moment is minus 4.4, Jake Minsell from Coventry. And if we just look up him, his graph is obviously rising and rising and rising. And he seems to be an 800-meter runner, or in fact all his best counting 5 performances were in the 800, all about 151, 152, so very impressive for an athlete of that age. So I hope you found this look at the RunBritain handicap system interesting, and I hope you understand it more if you have a handicap, if you're from the UK. What is your handicap if you have one? Comment below. Do you understand how the stats are worked out now? Does it make more sense? Do you agree with it? Do I need to improve the algorithm? Probably do, but it's probably, I think it's never perfect because it's all based on data. I'm not sort of sitting there thinking, well, was this a hard race or not? It's all based on an algorithm, and you can't obviously be looking at every single race or part run because there literally are thousands and thousands of them. But I hope it gives people a good idea. And as you saw from the national ladder for the top men and women in the country, the names you'd expect to see are towards the top. So, I hope you found this interesting, and look forward to seeing the next one then. Bye!